Find out how a chance job offering can change your life. Tune in and watch Dr. Srinivasan with me now. Thank you.
Uncommon Sense with Junia Doan, sharing the wisdom and insight of those who have been there and done that.
Hello everybody, I'm Junia Doan. Welcome back to another edition of Uncommon Sense. And a special warm welcome to those of you who are viewing this show for the very first time. On this program, I interview a guest, and we all share in the wisdom and the generosity and the experience of this person. With me today is Mandayam Srinivasan, head of the Touch Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I will say just a brief word about the Touch Lab. There, if I understand it properly, have three general research goals. One, they wish to understand how the hand functions, how touch is conveyed through the system, touch information is conveyed to the brain through touch. And what does that tell us about physics and physiological reaction? A second area is robotic devices, design of, and the third area is virtual reality. How can you design a program or a series of programs that give you the sense of doing it as if you were doing it in real time for yourself? So I would also like to add one other thing, that Srini, which is his nickname, is here because of our wonderful Matrix Ribbon Festival, and so we welcome you.
Thank you.
I wondered what drew you to such an interesting area of research.
It was not a straightforward path that drew me to this research. I have a checkered past as far as research areas are concerned. I was originally trained as a civil engineer in India, and then I did a master's in aeronautical engineering.
Oh my goodness.
Then I came to Yale.
Yeah.
And there I did applied mechanics, applied math, very theoretical kind of thesis.
Yes.
But the end of it, I didn't have any marketable skills. So I essentially did a second PhD by going to Department of Anesthesiology at Yale, doing neuroscience. So there was this lab where I heard they were recording from mechanoreceptors in the skin. So I thought, I didn't want to do some regular mechanical engineering. This sounded interesting, and I thought I would give it a try for a year, and then I would move on. But it turned out that it was so interesting. In fact, they hired me because they thought I would maintain their devices and I would, maintain their computer programs, but I did no such thing. Because I started reading papers, and they were very interesting, and I realized that mechanical engineers somehow had not paid attention to touch, but mechanics is as important to touch as optics is to vision or acoustics to hearing. So I thought maybe there is an angle that I could approach the field in a way that had not been done before. And it turned out that changed my life. The first time I heard actually the recordings, the neural traffic come from the receptors and that we could hear through the speakers, I was hooked. I was listening to the actual transmission of information, touch information, from the skin to the brain. And that was amazing.
Hands would be the logical appendage to study, but does the forearm or do the feet have the same ability to transmit and give us information?
Right.
It
Skin
so
all over the body has receptors which respond to forces or pressure and which convey information through neural impulses to the brain. It's just that the density of receptors, that is the number of receptors per a unit square millimeter, for example, is much higher in the fingertip. And as we move towards the body, it becomes less and less. So what we say our spatial resolution, that is how fine things you can discriminate, is the best at the fingertip and reduces. And you can do this very simply. I mean, if you take 2 points, say
Right.
2 pens or something, you
Right.
can discriminate that within when they are a millimeter or less than a millimeter apart. But as you go towards the back, even if they are a centimeter apart, you won't be able to tell they are 2 separate points.
When you did your first PhD, had you
Now the second one was not a PhD, it was effectively a
okay?
PhD.
Had you thought about the job market before you went down that path?
No, not really. So I was on what I wanted to do was take some really difficult problem, especially difficult mathematical problem,
Right.
and solve it purely by analytical means. I didn't even want to use computers. And somehow using computers was somehow a cop-out or something. And so, but it was very difficult. I found out how difficult real-world problems can be,
Right.
even with sophisticated mathematics. So the problem I wanted to solve and the problem I was able to solve, there was no correspondence. I had to make lots of approximations, and in the end, I'm proud of my thesis, but in the end, the problem that I solved, was not interesting to the rest of the world, at least so far.
We all have that. Somewhere in our life, we
Some-
want to do something, and
Yeah, but that was actually, it was revealing. But what it gave me was because I changed fields in so many different
Right.
areas, in science, engineering, and as well as biology, it gave me a kind of confidence that I could deal with wide variety of problems if they came at me and make a reasonable stab at them.
how do you get ideas? How does your mind work? Does it cross across what you have studied? Is it someone said something to you at the coffee shop or at home?
That's a very mysterious process, I guess. I don't exactly know how the ideas come from, but when you have an idea, to be able to recognize it, I think also takes some training. I think if you keep thinking about new and diverse problems, when you have an idea, then you say, okay, is this a great idea, or is this an okay idea? Is this something worth pursuing? In fact, in science and engineering, there are really millions of questions
Right.
that you can pursue at any time. So what makes, I suppose, some scientists or engineers better than or contribute more than some others might be, it is this judgment. I mean, there is always luck, of course.
Right.
You go after a really difficult problem, and in
Right.
the end, it is not resolvable within your lifetime, perhaps.
Right.
But the thing is that judgment about what is interesting and what is fundamental or something important, and at the same time is solvable, and design an approach to it.
How do you make that judgment? What are the questions you would ask yourself?
Right. I guess the very first question is this interesting to me? Is this, given whatever experiences, life experiences that I have had so far, at that stage, is this problem just simply, if I put in a year or 2 years and do some experiments or theory or whatever it is, maybe it is solvable to some extent. In my experience, actually, no problem is completely solvable.
Right.
As soon as you solve one thing, 10 other questions emerge. So in a way, that keeps us in business, academics. but
True.
but the thing is, there are some problems that really you think, wow, if we could do that, that would change the viewpoint of at least that field, or it would probably.
So you would start with a possible useful goal that interests you, but with what you feel is achievable in your lifetime. Right.
Or within, in fact, maybe not even, at least within 3-4 years.
In
For
3-4
example, that's the thing I learned from my PhD thesis, was that, even though there are these adversities, things that you didn't anticipate, I think there are always lessons from them. In fact, from my PhD thesis, I learned how not to pick a problem. And
Tell us about that.
that was as important as
Yes.
how to pick a problem. Like I said, I picked this theoretically complicated problem that existed for a long time, but it was attacked by mathematicians, applied mathematicians, maybe 30, 40 years ago before, and the field had kind of given up on it. But I picked it up thinking that, oh, if I solved it, the world would beat a path to my door. But nothing of the sort happened. And then I realized that science and engineering, even though there is a novelty of the problem, difficulty of the problem
Right.
are prized, it is very important that you are part of this social group, and the social group has certain interests at that time. And if you pick problems within those, and that may be because like nanotechnologies
Right.
now or something, it is known that that is possibly a solution to problems that you couldn't solve before, then if you go in that direction, the probability of success is high. But it is like mining though. You go and you don't know where you hit a strain that is
Yeah.
useful.
When you say social group, what do you mean by that?
I mean, there is, for example, within science, right? There is a set of, I don't believe now that science is a solitary activity, though it can be. I mean, one person can go off into the woods and think deeply and come up with a whole new concept of the world in scientific terms. It can happen. But the probabilities of that are kind of small, I think. Where it is exciting is there are lots of smart people thinking about whole classes of problems, and then each one brings to it their own unique perspective, and then they try to make progress, and over time something happens and the field grows, or sometimes field dies because it is waiting for some other new technology to come.
The measurement system.
Measurement system, perhaps tools,
Right.
what you couldn't do before. For example, in touch,
Right.
touch has lagged behind vision and hearing for a very long time. Partly it may be because there are no dominant touch-related impairments. You have a lot of blind people, you have hearing impaired people, but you don't see a lot of, though there are a few in the world, you don't see touch impaired people. So that may be part of the reason. The other part is also it's very complex. It is
Right.
the information to the brain, whereas in the eye it just comes from the retina, whereas in the ear it comes from the cochlea. Isolated pieces, though they are very complex.
Right.
But for touch, it's all over the body, skin is all over the body, and not only that, you have receptors in the joints, in tendons, in muscles, and all of it together give you the perspective when I lift this glass of water, what it is, its shape, its texture, its weight, so on. So the brain integrates from diverse sources. And in order to do any kind of controlled scientific experiments, you needed some advancements in robotics. So
In the body?
In robotics.
Robotics, yes.
Because, for example, with a monitor, with
Right.
a video monitor, you can do quite a bit of visual experiments. With set
Right.
of speakers or headphones, you can do quite a bit of scientific experiments. But in order to apply controlled stimuli, you needed some device that could control it. You needed a computer that was able to control it. So it needed the right tools. Even now, we don't have the fancy tools that vision and audition have, and hopefully we have made some progress and it will continue.
Do you take no for an answer easily?
Depends.
why?
Sometimes you write a proposal, you put your heart and soul into it, and it comes back from reviews, and the reviewers just say, no, this is not the thing to be done. Then you put it away for a while, and you think sometimes maybe they are right, and sometimes they are not. But usually what happens is, if you have thought through, and sometimes a proposal can be ahead of its time. So after a few years, it may need to be couched in a different way. So now, for example, when I started in the mechanical engineering department at MIT, some professor came and asked me, and I was working on touch perception. So he said, what has perception got to do with mechanical engineering? It should be in brain and cognitive sciences, or it should be in some other area. But it turns out that for touch, it is exactly where mechanical engineering is the one that transforms the physics of the world into neural signals. So it is, and perception is very much a part of it. So that's how perception comes into mechanical engineering.
When you deal with a very young child and they are learning, do they place more of an emphasis on touch
I
or
guess
less?
Yeah, it is known that kids, for example, are great experimenters. You know, that's why they grab onto things and then they put it in their mouth. For example, it's interesting that the density of receptors that I talked about in the fingertip, it's also about the same in the tongue and in the lips. So those are the three parts of the body where you have maximum number of touch receptors within certain areas, and it is most sensitive. So in a way, when they are picking something up and putting it into their mouth, they are basically learning about the physics of the world. Partly. Maybe I'm sure there are other emotional and other parts too, but certainly physics.
Do you know, or would you speculate if someone has a burn on their hand or something, the way they then experience, is it different in the brain? Like you said, you really heard the sound.
Well, it depends on how serious the burn is, what degree of burn, whether the receptors have come back, whether the connections are similar, stuff like that. But eventually, I think first degree burns and all that, if it is just the epidermis that goes off, then it is healed. I mean, I know personally of one experience where in India I was chopping a coconut with a machete, and I literally chopped off a little bit of my finger. Now it has grown back, but the touch is not the same because the connections aren't exactly the same as before. So it depends on the seriousness of it.
Does India and the West have a different way of gaining knowledge or using knowledge, or?
Certainly in terms of traditions, the Indian tradition of learning knowledge and the Western tradition of learning knowledge are quite different. But over time, science and engineering has pervaded all over the world, and it is becoming more or less uniform. But yet, I think how you approach a particular topic and what you judge as important, I think definitely depends on the in terms of your upbringing. For example, in my house, I come from a Brahmin community, which is like religious leaders, and there is tremendous importance placed on education, on learning. In fact, so much so that money making is seen as something that is not a good thing. And given that kind of importance from childhood, so we would always, and also sports are not encouraged that much. It is always books, you have to be first in the class or whatever, or you have to know things.
But in academics, not in any other.
Not generally.
Not necessarily music or art or.
It can be, but also India being a third world country,
Right.
the parents want their children to live well, which means that the chances of them leading reasonable middle class lives, rests on good education. As a musician, it's
Right.
less of a chance.
More interest in science.
Science and
Or
engineering,
medical.
generally, it's true. Medical engineers, that's why you have all these software engineers.
What did your parents do by way of helping you learn when you were very young?
It is really, in the beginning it is through stories. It is the stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata, which are epics, where there are, that's how you teach what the ideals are and what is the concept of dharma, they say, which is the righteous living. So through those stories, they convey, what is good, what is bad, and so on. And also in my house, there was also particular interest in philosophy, in terms of what is the nature of the world. Is the world real? Is this all just a dream? Or is it quote unquote real? And there are different schools of thought, Indian philosophy, just like in Western philosophy. In fact, many times I think back and why, even though I took a circuitous route to come to perception and touch, I think that what I am trying to do is to apply Western methods to Eastern questions. That is a question of perception, question of what. In fact, for a long time, people think touching is what makes something real, right? What you see in vision is not real because it can be illusion. You can alter photographs, you can alter video. Similarly, sound can be synthesized, so that's not real. Whereas touch is, by touching, you know that it's real. But unfortunately or fortunately, our own work has shown that touch can be as virtual as vision. For example, we have these robots in my lab which you can hold and you can touch a virtual object that doesn't exist. So unfortunately, we have taken that anchor away, but at least that's the truth.
What questions would you like answered?
I would really like to answer. There are two parts to this. One is the scientific part, the other is the technology part, and I cannot give up one or the other. The scientific part really is understanding when I touch something and I feel the texture of it. What are all the transformations that happen before I perceive this as this cloth with a texture? There are many, many steps. I mean, there are forces imposed on the skin, then skin distorts, then neural impulses flow, and many parts of the brain.
May I just ask one question, because we're going to shortly run out of time. I meant what questions would you like answered was referring to the question in your house and possibly other ones.
Okay.
Is this reality real, or is
Right.
it something else? What are the questions along those lines?
Yeah, so it is the question of, is the world real in any sense? Does it exist? Is there a way for us to find out that that is real? But it seems to me all the scientific methods and all the instruments cannot really answer that question. It is because all the instruments are only interfaces to this apparent world, and we can ascertain structures in that world or the laws of the physics laws, but really to answer the question of this is not the way. At least enlightened Indians say the only way is to focus your mind on those problems and ponder.
And ponder.
But so far I have been unable to do it. I have to write grant proposals.
When you raise your children now, how do you raise them in this regard?
I try to give them this, but the thing is, you have to be careful. They need to have some sort of anchor too. I mean, you can't totally confuse them. So I'm sure we will, these are, I mean, I have, as I said, triplets, one child, and I don't have any other children. So we try to do the best we can, and we will only know later on whether,
Right.
whether we succeeded or not.
Isn't it? But I mean, do you ask that question?
Yeah, I have, definitely. My
What?
kids already, think of that. God, what is God? What's the concept of God? Who is God? Is there a God? How do you show there is a God? Is it important to show there is a God? So, can you find a God within yourself? I mean, is it just a concept that is useful for you to be a kind, caring human being? Mm-hmm. Or is it something external, somebody who can be angry at you, who can be kind to you, and who is pleased by what you do? Is it that kind of God?
How would an 8-year-old answer that?
They ask, actually, surprisingly, if you ask them, they are pretty much with it. They are not totally, snowed by such questions. So they are okay. They can handle it.
Wonderful what you're doing. We want to thank Srini for being with us today. We've learned a great deal from him, and that is life is serendipitous. He went for his doctorate, which he achieved, and found out there was really no job opportunities, so he segued into a different field. And in the course of just nosing around, reading, he got really excited about things. And so he is exploring, as I mentioned, these 3 areas. But what's really interesting is the overriding question that seemed to appear in his home in India, which is reality real? And how do you know it? By implication. How can you prove it? Because there's much emphasis on science and engineering and learning in India as a way of creating a future economic life. And to his great surprise, this field was a good way to answer that, except so far it hasn't. It has just almost done the same thing as sight and hearing, and that is a virtual reality that you can have a little bit of a non-documented or not clear. It's real, but it could be simulated, as we have found. So this is something to ponder on, as he said. What is reality? But you can go and do some very real things in your life. Remember, this is a show that talks about kindness. Do something sweet for someone you know every single day and someone you don't know. And remember, carry a smile on your face. It may mean a great deal to someone who passes you by on the street. Thank you so much, and tune in next time. Thank you. This is a wonderful, wonderful question.
To share your comments and suggestions, contact Junia. The email address is juniadone@aol.com or write to Post Office Box 169, Midland, Michigan 48640.